Good evening, everybody. I'm Stacia Brandon, the Literature and Humanities Program Manager at the Seattle Public Library. And as we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. These are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past and present and thank them for their stewardship of this land. Welcome to our conversation with David Williams and Marianne Gwynn, presented in partnership with Elliott Bay Book Company. We're grateful to our author series sponsor, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation and the Seattle Times for generous support of library programs. Thanks as well to the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everyone in our community. I have a couple of quick announcements before we get started. Our friends over at Elliott Bay Book Company have signed copies of David's book, Home Waters, and Elliott Bay is open for limited browsing, curbside pickup, and delivery. So you could order David's book through their website, elliottbaybook.com, or you could stop by and do a little browsing. And we're going to pop the link to the book in the chat as well if you want to check that out. My next little announcement is after David and Marianne's conversation, we'll have time for questions from you. So you can ask your question at any time by writing it in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. So you can do that anytime. If you know that you have a question now, pop it on in. And then after they're done with their conversation, we'll go ahead and get to as many of the questions from you as we're able to. Now I am delighted to welcome Karen Maeda Allman from Elliott Bay Book Company, who's going to introduce tonight's speakers. Hey, Karen.
Hi, and it's my pleasure to introduce David B. Williams and also Marianne Gwynn tonight. David B. Williams is a naturalist, writer, walking tour leader, and educator. He's the author of many books which have helped us better understand and appreciate our shared history and natural history, especially that of the Seattle area. His books include Too High and Too Steep, which was the winner of the 2016 Virginia Marie Fokins Award, sponsored by the Association of King County Historical Associations. He also is the author of Stories in Stone and also the perennial bestseller, Seattle Walks, which received a new level of popularity during the coronavirus lockdown. And today, as the weather has improved and we're all emerging from our houses. He's here tonight with us to speak about his new book, Home Waters, A Human and Natural History of Puget Sound, published by the University of Washington Press. Home Waters has much to teach us about Puget Sound ecology, beginning with information about Coast Salish communities from the first stories and archaeological evidence through modern times, and not just through recovering place names. He also takes us into our underwater forests and the lives of the creatures who make a home there. He tells us about human navigation on the Puget Sound, from the mosquito fleet to ferries and the ongoing tribal canoe journeys that happen each summer. And he writes about the ways in which human activities have degraded the sound, weighing in on the current condition of its plant and animal life. And in the process, he's helping us uncover what's often invisible to many of us, helping us understand what we're missing and that if we change our ways, it's not too late. David B. Williams appears in conversation with Marianne Gwynn, and she, for many years, was the books editor for the Seattle Times, and she's currently writing reviews and articles about authors and books for the Seattle Times, the Los Angeles Times, Kirkus Reviews, Newsdays, and elsewhere. She was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for her contributions to the Seattle Times coverage of the Exxon Valdez oil spill and its aftermath, and in 2017 served as a judge for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. She's also a long-term board member of the National Book Critics Circle. And so we're going to welcome both Marianne Gwynn and David B. Williams to our virtual stage to talk about Home Water.
Thanks, Karen. I'm very happy to be here with David. I just finished his book yesterday. I've known David for a long time. He was one of my most stalwart reviewers when I was the book editor at the Seattle Times, and I followed his career with great interest. One thing that struck me about this latest book is David, how you've kind of gone from the particular, from stones and cairns and then city streets and then entire cities. And then you broadened your view to Puget Sound, which I suspect made things progressively more complicated for you as a writer. So why did you decide to do that?
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you, Marianne, for participating in this. And this is, as I think many of you know, my book launch. I'd in particular really like to thank Karen from Elliott Bay Books, not only for tonight, but for her ongoing support, and of course for Elliott Bay Bookstore for their ongoing support, not just for me, but for local authors in this region. I'd like to thank Stesha and Marion from the Seattle Public Library, again, for their support of all that writers do in this region. And in particular at the University of Washington Press, I'd like to thank Nicole Mitchell, who is the director and who has supported this book from its very beginning more than 5 years ago. Andrew Brzezinski for his editing and support, Margaret Sullivan for taking it through the process, and Julie Fergus and Kate Heacock for the work they continue to do in promoting it. And in particular, I'd like to have a shout out for Mike Repass, whose financial support and also just emotional support has been integral to the success of the press, but also for helping me in writing this book. I'd also, a couple other final ones, The Unspeakables, you know who you are. And those of you who have the book know that the dedication is to Marjorie, my wife. And as it says, to Marjorie, here's a shot of whiskey. You're always there for me, and a pleasure and an honor to have you. You make writing possible. Before I begin, Marianne, if I may, I'd like to start with about a 5-minute reading from the book and then address your question, if you don't mind. Great, thank you. So this comes from the beginning of Home Waters. In the summer of 2018, I grieved with millions of people around the world. Our collective sadness focused on a 20-year-old mother, Talakwa, one of a dwindling number of orca who regularly visit Puget Sound. On July 24th, Talakwa had given birth to her second child, a daughter, who died within 30 minutes. For the next 17 days, she carried the 6-foot-long body of her dead offspring on a journey of more than 1,000 miles. Finally, Talakwa let her calf go. Our hearts broke. Then 2 years later, on September 6, 2020, it was with much joy that whale researchers announced Talakwa had given birth 2 days earlier. The healthy and precocious boy calf, dubbed J57, was born in the Strait of Juan de Fuca after an 18-month gestation. To paraphrase Emily Dickinson, hope is a baby orca in Puget Sound. Mourning the loss of a child is a natural response for humans and orca. Both species are smart, self-aware, and deeply connected to their families. Clearly, Talakwa, like us, had loved her daughter and did not want to part from her. And as we learned, her extended family tried to help by providing food for the grieving mother. Ecologists suggested that they might also have been mourning with her. Talakwa and her family are members of a group of more than 70 orca known as the Southern Resident Killer Whales. These animals, which have evolved a culture and community unique to their home in Puget Sound, travel together, hunt together, and communicate using their own distinctive dialect. Solidifying their cultural affinity, the Southern residents also rely on the collective knowledge of their elders, particularly the matriarchs, who act as guides and teachers to their family members. Why shouldn't they also love and grieve together? And why shouldn't we also love and grieve with Talakwa? Few animals are as sacred and iconic to Puget Sound residents as orca, or in more dire straits: habitat loss, disturbance from noise and boat traffic, exposure to an ever-increasing toxic mixture of pollutants, and overfishing of their favorite food, salmon, have pushed the Southern resident population to the point where their very survival in Puget Sound is in doubt. For many who followed Talakwa, their grief for her was compounded by their grief for the environment of Puget Sound and the way its degradation affects orcas and humans. If Talakwa and her calf couldn't thrive, what did it mean for us? More than any other story, Talakwa's loss crystallized the central environmental challenges of Puget Sound. The orca are suffering, the salmon are suffering, we are responsible. For most of my life, I've lived within a few miles of Puget Sound, the narrow inland sea between the Cascade and Olympic Mountains. I knew that I lived by troubled waters, but did not fully grasp the magnitude of the crisis that had been arising around me, like the tide submerging a low island. Although I saw myself as someone deeply aware of my natural surroundings, I realized I simply hadn't paid close enough attention to a place I love and where I intend to reside for the rest of my life. I needed to take heed of all the people who have lived here, how they have related to the landscape over the millennia, and how their stories could provide a better understanding of the conditions now shaping the lives of modern residents. Furthermore, as a writer who is generally focused on stories about the land, I had not fully appreciated the water and those who dwell in it. Standing on the shoreline or riding a ferry and seeing only the surface of the water, which tends to appear untainted and beautiful, I had long failed to see the interconnected lives of the plants and animals beneath and to understand how they sustain and breathe life, both metaphorically and literally, into Puget Sound. The effects of human activity, overfishing, pollution, and climate change reach deep beneath the surface. Our actions, their lives, our lives. We cannot cut one strand without unraveling the many connections that link us. This book then is my way to rectify my lack of understanding of the cultural and ecological history of my home waters and to provide a resource for others. The more of us who know and care about this place, the more momentum we can build to change our ways. We have reached a critical confluence for the waters of Puget Sound. Paraphrasing Wallace Stegner, is this a native home of hope where we can create a society to match its scenery, or will we succumb to baser values? Since I began writing Home Waters, my own enhanced appreciation and understanding of Puget Sound's incredible diversity, beauty, and potential for recovery have led me to believe that the most valuable assets of Puget Sound are not the resources we have long extracted, but the relationships that residents can make with this place. Learning from the past is central to forging and nurturing those relationships and to creating a positive future for Puget Sound and all its inhabitants. By taking this journey, I feel I gained an extra dimension of sight. Now, when I look out over the surface of Puget Sound, I can see deeply into its history and the peopling of the landscape, its residents' travels by canoe, steamer, and ferry, their endeavors to carve out a living, and their fears of invaders. I can see deep underwater to lush forests of exquisite beauty and complexity, to corpulent clams that can outlive people, and to fish whose annual spawning creates a spasm of desire, attracting uncountable numbers. I can also see into a future where I have hope. If the residents of Puget Sound hold this place to be special and unique, as I think we do, then we will recognize our responsibilities not only to this generation, but to the generations to come, human and more than human. Thank you. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, this is, as we were talking at the beginning, this book, I started work on it in October of 2016 and really wanted to write a book that took that big story of the Sound and wove it through that, both the human element and the natural history element, always looking for what are the connections between the species who inhabit this place and the landscape around them, the relationship between newcomers and residents who've long lived here, however you want to define that, the relationship between the different species, how they evolved to place, to the geology of this place. And then what is that relationship between all of us who live here? Because we are all connected to this landscape.
And one thing that strikes me about Puget Sound is it's beautiful. It looks nice when we look out our window or when we take the ferry, as you point out in your book. But it's easy to forget about it and not think about it. It also doesn't act up very much. It's not like Lake Superior, where huge storms come off it and disrupt things for days. So when you're thinking about preserving it, what special challenges does that create in terms of persuading people of its value?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, as I say, I think and as you say, when we look out, it looks pretty nice. It's in pretty good shape. I mean, all of us have been places out on ferries or on the shoreline and looked across, and it is one of the most beautiful places there is. So I think that is a challenge. And I think my goal was, as I said, was to look under that surface and realize that it's so much deeper, both literally and figuratively, than what we see out there. And also, I think that we need to think about, it's not just the sound and the water, it's that entire watershed. You know, the state defines Puget Sound as the entire watershed. So from the top of Mount Rainier to the Canada border, all the way out to Cape Flattery, it's all part of that system. So for me, I think that's part of it, is the way to think about it, is that those interconnections, that there's so much we don't see, but yet we feel the effects of. You know, we all know salmon and orca, but salmon are connected to herring, which are connected to the kelp I talk about. Orca is connected to salmon, which is connected to herring, which is connected to the human story. I mean, they're all interrelated. So I guess that's what I will always keep emphasizing, is that aspect of it, is thinking about our actions directly impact everything out there.
So how did the fact that what you're writing about, you as a writer, you actually can't see, most of it is literally underwater. What special challenges did that create for you?
The special challenge, which I was really lucky to sort of have to deal with, was to try and go out in the field with biologists who were doing the research, and then to try and incorporate that in. So throughout the book, one of the things I do try and do is be that narrator who is seeing the sound, seeing many of these things for the first time, and trying to express that enthusiasm. I was lucky enough to go out with people who knew kelp better than anybody, and to be able to then describe what is generally covered up. And we got to see some of it when it was out of the water. Or to go out with the state, they dredge the bottom of the sound yearly to do a biological sample, and to be able to go out on that boat while they're dredging stuff up and have this, like a ping pong table of animals dumped out on this table in front of us, and sort them out and see the beauty, the diversity, and then all that stuff gets put back into the water. And so I was really tried to take advantage of the biologists who were doing the work and try and share their stories throughout. So as you, I'm sure, noticed, there's a lot of places I just drop in stories about the plants and animals, because they're just so amazing. I mean, it's 900 feet deep.
They are amazing.
Yeah.
I learned so much about critters I had the barest awareness of from your book. Another thing that I learned from your book is I guess what you would call the perhaps underwater geology of Puget Sound, and how it makes it unique, but it also creates some problems for the sound. Could you explain the role of the sills that influence the Puget Sound tidal flux, and how that affects the sound?
Yeah, I mean, that was, as those of you who've been on my books, geology is what really one of my passions. So I always have to drop that in, no matter how important it is. And here it's critically important. And one of the stories was this idea that between the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the sort of main part of the sound to the south, there's a sill, or a spot, a little uprising, if you will, a ridge underwater, so that the sound may be in places, you know, a couple hundred feet deep. With the sills, they get very close to the surface, and it changes the circulation of the sound. So things that are in the sound, that come into sound, the nutrients, have a tendency to sort of get recirculated. Someone described it as the memory of Puget Sound, which I just thought was a lovely phrase. But also pollutants, as they're heading out of the sound with the tidal change, have that same problem of some additional circulation, so they stay in the sound. So the sound is quite different from the strait. The Hood Canal has its own sill, so there's a slightly different system there. There's a sill in the Tacoma Narrows, so it's slightly different south of there. Whidbey Basin doesn't have a sill and has another issue, that, I mean, an aspect of it, that all that fresh water coming from the Skagit. And so the geology is really essential. And one way it plays out is we see it with some of the species that live here, particularly the rockfish. There's a couple species that are really are unusual because of that circulation pattern, which can be a benefit because it recirculates nutrients, but can also be a problem because it it leads to some pollutant issues, and it leads to also a lack of some biological diversity. So it always gets back to geology.
Of course. I was really fascinated by your description of what the sound was like 12,000 years ago when people first started coming into the area. Can you give people who are listening in kind of a visual picture?
Yeah, so the ice retreats by about 15,000 years ago. The sound is connected back to the ocean, and it becomes a saltwater body. But the land around it, it's a slow process. I mean, you can imagine you have a 3,000 foot thick sheet of ice moved across the land, basically sort of scraped it bare. So when the first people that we know, we have archaeological evidence, get here about 13,000 years ago. It was a very open habitat. It was cooler, more sort of savanna-like, with very different, deer, very important, ungulates, much more important. Few other big animals are left. We do see some evidence that they start going, basically all of the big animals, the mastodon, the mammoths, the big sloths, a couple of species of big bear, a big bison, are all here till about maybe 11,000 years ago. And then all the megafauna are gone. But then it takes another several thousand years, really to about 5,000 years ago, that we see the Western red cedar, the forest that we think of today, has really become the dominant story. And then the other aspect is there's this geologic part that the mountains are very eruptive during this period of 12,000 years ago. Baker's erupting, Mount St. Helens erupting much more often, Rainier. So this idea that landscape was changing so much on an order that we can't imagine, even though sadly we seem to be attempting to do that with climate change, create a similar type geologic change. But it's an unusual period when people were first arriving here.
I feel kind of dumb about this, but I didn't realize Glacier Peak was an active volcano, but it sounds like it was quite active in those days.
It was quite active, yeah. So it's one of the five. So Baker Glacier, Rainier, Adams, and St. Helens. Yeah, and you're not alone. I mean, Glacier doesn't have that classic look of the cone, and it was really the last one that people realized was a volcanic structure. But yeah, it's definitely had some issues.
So you write a lot about the tribes, both historically and then after the first contact with whites. And one of the things that you wrote about that was just fascinating to me was the canoes they built. I mean, they were truly awesome structures. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how they were built and what they enabled the native people living in the area. What did they enable them to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the canoes, as I said, and it's interesting, we know that people were probably using some sort of boat from the earliest time here. We have no idea what it was because we don't have any evidence. And as I said, not till 5,000 years ago do cedars come in and become the dominant source for these canoes. But the ethnographic work and the early work that you can read from some of the explorers, just these beautiful boats that could hold 20, 30, 40 people. There were boats that were adapted for being out on the open ocean, bigger ones that were more adapted for for battles within the sound itself. And it gets back to your earlier observation, Marianne, about it's relatively benign in the sound. Yes, the tides are an issue, the currents are an issue, but we don't have hurricanes and all the other nasty things that places have. So the canoes that developed really see sort of two primary types called the Coast Salish canoes. There was one that was sort of more of a trolling canoe, really more for hunting, going out, the different animals out there. But then there was one that was really a freight canoe. And one of the ethnographers who was in this area describes it as a woman's canoe. And one of the things I think that's interesting about that, I was asking an archaeologist about that and not reading about it any other place. He said, well, she was one of the few ethnographers who actually asked those types of questions and interesting, just the difference between males asking and females asking. questions and thinking about relation. But said those canoes could go anywhere in Puget Sound, up the rivers, they could go across the sound, they could put up a sail. And I really think of this as the sinews that really bound together this place, that the canoes helped create community in the landscape, that people could go anywhere, and they did. I mean, they didn't, people, and still do. I mean, this is not a this is not a was, this is a now, particularly as Karen pointed out with the canoe journey and talking to people involved with the tribes and involved with this sort of revitalization of canoe culture, that people still do it. And they don't think anything of it. It's like, oh, I'm out on the Kitsap Peninsula, I want to come across to Lake Washington to take advantage of the freshwater. Let's hop in the boat and go. So you could go anywhere and really have that, as I said, that community. It's really a central part, I think, is what the canoes created, this community for people here.
Did they extend beyond Puget Sound? Like, I mean, they actually would go up into what we now think of as BC to encounter
they would definitely
tribes there
travel.
and wage war and.
Yeah, and it was a two-way. It was definitely a two-way street that people would, people from the north, indigenous people from the north, would come down into the sound. They often would certainly come down some of these bigger canoes, and there was definitely havoc wrought by that. But people go in both directions, and there's a great story of a battle on near Salt Spring Island of many of the groups down here going up to sort of to fight a group up in that area because of problems. So yeah, they could go, they went everywhere. I mean, it just, like we would hop in a car to drive to Olympia, they'd hop in a boat, people would hop in a boat and go down to, I mean, it was amazing. So.
You're right that the tribes did a better job of, they obviously were very dependent on natural resources, that they did a better job of conserving what they used. And I have to confess that than we do now, obviously. And I guess I thought that was more of a passive relationship, that they just didn't have as big an impact as we have had on the land. But you write that they actually had conservation strategies and techniques of their own. Could you talk about a couple of those?
Yeah, there's a wonderful paper by two archaeologists, Virginia Butler and Sarah Campbell, where they look at what they describe as the 7,500-year archaeological record of salmon for Coast Salish people in this area, and make the point exactly what you're saying, is that they basically, salmon is one of the sort of two primary food sources. Excuse me, the other one, herring, equally important as salmon, but they never overfish, they never overharvest, they never change their diet because of that. And it really gets back to this idea of, again, of community, that people had a certain responsibility. They describe it as sort of regulations, beliefs, and traditions, that it was really part of the culture, that someone might say control a certain area for salmon fishing, and that person or people was responsible for it. They were stewards for it. And they, at times, there maybe weren't as many fish there, and they would then reach out to someone else to be able to fish in their area. And if someone wanted to fish in their location, there was this reciprocity. So it was about a relationship and a community feel that people were in it together. And then the idea of the first salmon ceremony was also, I think, critically important from what they say in the paper, that, there was a time when you harvested fish because you understood what the lives of the fish were. You didn't harvest at a time when you're going to take too many young or too many females. So again, it was about an understanding of place. It was about how had they, both the salmon and herring, say, had adapted to this place over time, and how have people adapted to that relationship too. It was an iterative process. They adapted, they realized, they looked, they understood, and thought about it. And so that was really a central thing, aspect of the story as I was researching, was thinking about, again, how do people live in place? And I think that was a central part of it, was living with that that respect and understanding. I have a quote from a woman who works for the Suquamish tribe, who basically says, you know, we need to pay attention. We need to, and the way I think about it is being present in the land and being aware and paying attention to what's around us. By if you develop those connections, you have that relationship, and you realize how critical our actions are in relationship to everything that's out there.
Thanks. There was a very interesting time in this area in the 19th century where the Hudson's Bay Company was operating, and the American settlers were also coming in. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the two cultures of the Hudson's Bay community and the settlers, and vis-a-vis their relationship with the natives?
Yeah. I mean, that was one of the things that I think I knew I knew very little about. And I had this, it's sort of funny, I'd long never understood why, you know, Seattle's settled in, the first Europeans arrived here in 1851, and yet the South Sound is settled earlier. The first Olympia is 1830 something, 1840 something, and 1840. And I never realized that people came overland first from the South, and that's what, and the Hudson's Bay Company comes from up from Fort Vancouver, and they arrive here 1822, 1823, and they really came with this idea of how do we make some money? You know, how do we trade with people? And they set up Fort Nisqually, and their relationship was really built on trade, not trying to take over. Yes, they caused problems. Yes, they did not respect people, as the native people, as probably as well as we would like people to think they should have. But it was a much more positive relationship between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Coast Salish people. When the Americans come in, that changes. They come in with an attitude of this is manifest destiny. We're here to take over the land, and they start using the resources in a much less steward-like. They're not good stewards. I mean, and it's hard to fault them. I mean, you come here. This is one of the greatest forests on earth in terms of you know, everything that's here. I mean, we've all seen that. We've, like those of us who've been out to Old Grove, seen this incredible forest. How could you imagine you were going to deplete the forest, or deplete the salmon, or deplete the herring? And yet there was no thought of that at all. That was never came into consideration. People always thought there would be enough. And even though we see as early as the 1880s, we see biologists starting to say, wait a minute, we need to be aware of this. So I think it was a real fundamental difference. And then the American settlers also came in with a much more negative view of the native people. There's some just horrible writings you read that people, that what they had to say, despite the fact of having benefited from them, and particularly some of the early settlers.
I remember your writing, and this is about something I'm going to ask you about next, about the steamboats that were plying the Sound, that almost literally every tree below a certain size was cut just to power the boats.
Yeah, the Mosquito fleet was sort of mind-blowing. I don't think, I know we can't even think about it. I mean, you know, we think there's a lot of boats here now, and yeah, there's probably more now, but to look down on the Sound and just seeing steamers going everywhere, and all those steamers relied on wood. And so they were probably cutting everything down, all the little trees down, before they turned to coal and to oil. But yeah, I mean, there are hundreds of these little vessels. And again, they function exactly like the canoe. They are that thread that binds together community and allows people to live anywhere in the Sound and still stay connected. But it was a huge change as they went from canoe and sailing to steamer, in terms of, certainly in terms of depletion of resource and production of, you know, what was being burned was probably not very pretty.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit more about the Mosquito fleet. I'm really sorry I missed that. What was it, and what did people do? Did they just say, hey, I'm going to buy a boat and I'm going to like go from Edmonds to, you know, to Kingston, and it's going to be great? How did it work? Or was it just sort of controlled chaos?
I would go with the latter. I think, controlled chaos. The first steamer arrives in Puget Sound in 1835. It was built in London as a paddle wheeler. They converted to a sailing ship. It goes down, around, eventually makes it into the Sound. That's the first. And then from then on, we just start to see dozens and dozens. I mean, at some point, the Mosquito Fleet, we have no idea how many people or how many ships were in it. And they range in size from 20 feet to almost 300 feet. Most of them, there's sort of there's really, the line I use is it's sort of like the way Justice Potter Stewart describes pornography. You can't define it, but you know it when you see it, and you know a Mosquito Fleet vessel. Pointy ended, flat bottomed, wood, steam driven, propeller powered on average, go anywhere, part gumption on the owner's part entrepreneurship, part Uber driver. I mean, and they carried everything. They went everywhere. I figured out there were at least 350 named stops in the Mosquito Fleet around the Sound. And this is sort of the greater Sound out into the Strait, but most of them in south of Admiralty Inlet, 350 places. And these were places where there were official stops, but you could also row your boat out to one. And I think when you're on the Sound, and we've all seen this, you'll see a row of pilings that lead out into the water, and you're like, what is that? That looks, what was going on here? My belief is it was probably a Mosquito Fleet dock, and people would they'd live anywhere. They'd flag it down. They'd just big enough for one of these little boats. If the right person came along, they'd pick you up. If they didn't, then the next person would pick you up. And sometimes there was a race between boats to pick up, see who could get there first. There were battles. They raced each other, and then a lot of them just sank too. That was a pretty standard story. They'd blow up and sink. But it must have just been, as you say, I would have loved to have seen it, just total chaos and energy on the water that we just don't have today. Yeah, I would love to have seen it too. So moving on to some of the Sound's creatures, I've often looked at kelp and thought it was kind of pretty and kind of weird and kind of slimy, but I had no idea that it was such a staple of the Sound ecosystem, and it supported so many other critters. So tell us a little bit about that. Yeah, I mean, the Mosquito Fleet, kelp is really that underwater forest, and the kelp forest, as people describe them, it's the equivalent of the temperate rainforest. It is essential, these forests are essential to the Sound. So kelp, we have about 18 or so species in the Sound, ranging from sort of understory ones, just like in a forest, to the big tall bull kelp that can grow dozens and dozens of feet. It's an annual species. So it creates a multi-layered community. It creates, and then at the bottom, they have these holdfasts that anchor the kelp to the rock. They're generally in shallow water. What a great term. I love that. Yeah. The holdfast. Right, exactly. We all need it more. Yes. And that holdfast has its own little ecosystem there. So the kelp sort of function as a nursery. It's a safe habitat for species. You can find little things, little amphipods, little things, little pinto bean sized animals. You can find orca. Orca drape themselves in kelp and no one really knows why. You can find young salmon. You can find young rockfish. You can find herring. You can find sea urchins. You can find sea stars. And then it has this, and it's providing this incredible amount of carbon. So a lot of animals are eating it, and probably heard this idea that forests are sort of made of salmon. As salmon die, then they get eaten and pooped up into the woods and provide nutrients. Same thing with kelp. It provides this essential source of carbon and other nutrients. So they're just critical. And sadly, like many things, the species, we don't see as extensive of forests as we used to. One of the aspects, I think, of kelp that really made them maybe not different, but really stood out for me is the relationship between people and kelp. Arguably, the longest relationship that people have to a non-human species in this landscape is to kelp. There's this idea that's come up in the last 20, 30 years, what's called the Kelp Highway, that people traveling to North America from Asia to sort of colonizing the New World, instead of coming overland, which probably many of them did, but they also probably paddled along the coast. And the kelp forest would have provided food, safe habitat, come down that Kelp Highway, and then one of the off-ramps would have been Puget Sound. And so we know that people have had this relationship that goes back thousands and thousands of years. And so it really epitomizes what I felt was one of my goals of the book, that weaving of human and natural history together for something that, as you said at the very beginning, Marianne, we overlook. We don't think about. We look out on the Sound, and my relationship to kelp was, oh, it's that stuff on the shoreline that's sort of spinachy and lettucey. And then I was lucky enough to spend, initially a long lunch with someone like, Mr. Kelpophile converted me. And then we went out in the field a couple times, Tom Mumford, just a wonderful person. And I really can't thank the biologists who helped me enough. That really opened up my eyes. And I feel incredibly fortunate that these people are out there doing this science that's really trying to understand the Sound and really trying to protect the Sound. I mean, I've heard people say sort of sometimes nasty things about it, the scientists, government scientists. And I interviewed many, was out in the field with them, and never, ever did I come across someone who wasn't concerned with protecting and having a better and more healthful Puget Sound than we have right now.
Sounds like they were vital to your effort.
Yes.
You write about many fascinating creatures, gooey ducks, rockfish, and I was personally astonished at the age to which some of these Sound denizens live. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, same boat. I say same thing. Particularly rockfish. I think, and I know for myself, I think of a fish, I think of a salmon. It lives, I don't know, 8, 10 years, maybe at most, outlier, but we know many of them have shorter lifestyles. Fish don't live that long. Rockfish, several species. We have 20 some odd, 28, 27 species in Puget Sound in one genus. They can live up to 100, 200 years. The oldest known rockfish was 205 years old when it died. They have a little bone otolith in their ear that you can age date, just like a counting the rings of a tree. And this rockfish was not collected here. It was actually collected up in Alaska, but we have that species. But there are many species here that live for well more than 100 years. And that just blew me away, that this amazing fish, and they're beautiful, really interesting animals. I mean, and then there's gooey duck. Again, gooey duck, it's that big thing that's down there that's scary looking, except when they're babies, cutest babies ever. The oldest one known was 173 years old. And they found ones 150 plus that are still reproducing. So just who knew? I didn't. Totally cool. Totally cool.
I didn't know. One thing you write about is all the different names rockfish are called when they wind up in restaurants. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, and I thought it was really fun too to look at them. And I'm going to have to confess, Marianne, I can't pull up what they're in the book, but none of them are popping into my head right this minute.
Well, the red snapper.
Oh yeah,
there's a red snapper, but
it ain't the red snapper. Well, the other one, the classic one, I think is Pacific Ocean perch, which is named for the Atlantic Ocean perch, which is not a perch, nor is the Pacific Ocean a perch. There is a perch in the Great Lakes. The Pacific Ocean perch is one of the rockfish. Yeah, so there are all these sort of odd names, and they finally sort of have come to some agreement, but I'm sure you go to a restaurant and you'll find things that are labeled something beyond what rockfish are, but they're really a really interesting group of species.
Speaking of restaurants and things we like to eat, why is a Pacific oyster? What did a Pacific oyster start out being, and what does that have to do with the Japanese American community in Puget Sound?
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So our native oyster is the Olympia oyster, which is the little round one about yay big, maybe a little bit bigger, really which was actually one of the first foods that was exported from Puget Sound, were the Olympia oysters. But starting in the early 1900s, a couple of Japanese immigrants to this area brought over an oyster because sadly, Puget Sound, like all other oyster places, particularly on the East Coast, had decimated their population. And we're trying to figure out ways, how do we replace our native oyster? So they brought in, a variety of ones were brought in, and the one that was most successful was this one from Japan, and actually started by these two gentlemen from Japan who finally were able to get them to sort of work here. But getting back to the Japanese-American story, sadly, with changes, the very racist laws in the state that start early, and then there's a couple in the 1920s, they basically get forced out of the business.
They couldn't own land, could they?
Right, they couldn't own land, and
Right.
so they lose that ability. And the Japanese oysters, they get bought, the ones that they had started, bought by a company that, and realizes that, sadly, that Japanese oyster is not a term that sells well. So they become Pacific oysters. But they originally were Japanese oysters, and Pacific oysters, which we all eat, that are eaten here, which is something like 95% of the oysters consumed in Puget Sound. None of them they're all non-native species. They all started as Japanese oysters.
Didn't some of the Japanese Americans who were involved in the business, didn't they come back after World War II and get re-involved?
Yeah, and get re-involved, and yeah, so they were central to the business prior to World War II and came back and helped with some of the revitalization of the business. And so yeah, that's a really interesting story. And then, oysters, Olympia oysters, we're now starting to see a really good restoration of Olympia oysters being returned to this area, particularly an organization like the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, which is seeding oysters around. And so we're starting to see this comeback of our native oyster in the Sound, which is great.
Reading your book, I was really struck by the amount of change the Sound has gone through in the last 12,000 years. Everything from the geological changes you talk about, the climate changes, and then of course the incredible changes wrought after white people came to the area, the extraction industries, and then masses of people moving in, and all this has happened in a very sort of short period of historical time. When you look out in the future, do you have a sense of what Puget Sound will look like and what shape it will be in say 200 years? I know that's a hard question.
Yeah,
but I thought I'd save my hardest one for last.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the big part, one thing that I came away from this in working on this book is I did come away with a sense of hope. And I wanted to write a book that was hopeful, because I think that, to me, the way I think of the change in the Sound, what's really changed is, I think those, particularly with European settlement and when whites come in, what happens is this idea of exploitation of natural resources that goes on for the first 100 years or so. And really in the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen a real fundamental change in the relationship between people who live in the Sound and how they use the Sound, that we've really gone from this idea of exploitation to an idea of stewardship. So I have a hope for the future. That we, of course, have to wrestle with climate change. But one of the advantages, I think, of the Sound, and this is pointed out to me by a biologist, is that the Sound itself, that body itself actually has a fairly unified way that people can affect it in terms of government. If you think of it as particularly area south of Admiralty Inlet, it's all a single, it's not multinational. So there's some jurisdictions here that have the potential to have a big effect. And I think this is an area where people want to benefit it. So I'd like to think, as we look to the future, we'll certainly see change. We're never going to go back to what it was, but I also do think we have the potential to make this a better place, to continue to work to make it a more healthy environment, ecosystem for all the species that live here, the human and the non-human. So I guess, as your final question, I would address it as really thinking in hopeful terms it's also just the way I view the world.
Great. Well, I'm with you. Okay, well, thank you so much, David. I'm going to duck out here, and Stesha Brandon of the Seattle Public Library is going to field some questions. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Marianne. Nice to see you. Thanks for the great interview. And hi again, David.
Hi, Stesha.
And it looks like we've got a couple questions in the Q&A, but I'll just take this as a moment to remind folks that if you have a question for David, you can pop it into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. You could also ask Marianne questions and we'll bring her back on if you like, but David's here to celebrate the launch of HomeWater, so we'll start with you. So the first question for you, David, says, congratulations on a wonderful expose about the connections of water, land, and all lifeways. Did you come across any firsthand stories about how Coast Salish peoples may have repopulated streams that may have had a history of decreased salmon, akin to salmon farming?
I didn't. That's a really interesting question. I didn't come across anything like that. I mean, one of the challenges, as you might imagine, is the written record, and particularly looking back sort of over time. The archaeological record provides a certain amount of information, but then there's a lot that we just don't know. So I did not come across anything like that, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just didn't see it.
Yeah, it's always tricky, and you know, maybe that will come forward or in the future at some point. Yeah. So Langdon Cook, another wonderful writer here in the area, asks, can you talk about the importance of herring to the Sound's web of life and how herring populations are faring today? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Hi, Lang. Thanks for the question. If you don't know Lang's book on salmon and you want to know about salmon, I highly recommend it. It's wonderful, and he's a wonderful writer. Herring are amazing. I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me in doing the research, and again, getting back into the archaeological record, herring are just as vital to salmon, to Coast Salish people, and all really up and down the coast. They show up just ubiquitously in the archaeological record. So there's this deep connection of a cultural relationship. But from a natural history relationship, the way I had it described to me was as being sort of the hub around which the ecosystem of Puget Sound revolves, because salmon are eating all those little things, and then they're getting eaten by everyone else. As someone put it, it was like they're good at converting nutrients to crunchy little meals. And when they arrive back in the Sound, particularly at the spawning time, if you've ever seen a spawning event here, it's astounding. I mean, everybody comes. All sorts of animals, from bears, wolves, maybe not in the Sound, but north, bears, wolves, fish, other fish, birds. It's just this riot of life because they are so essential to the food web here. I mean, they really are the thing that everything revolves around. Again, sadly, we've definitely had there's a major problem with the herring here. We have many fewer than we did. But what's interesting about the herring is there's a bunch of different populations around the Sound. And the one that gets all the press is Cherry Point, which has suffered. But we're seeing other bodies around the Sound, other areas around the Sound that are doing better, particularly out in Hood Canal. The herring there are doing pretty well. And we're seeing a couple. This year's was a huge herring spawn event. And the way biologists phrase it, it's sort of like it's a diverse, it's the portfolio effect, is that all these different herring around, they're putting all their resources in all over the Sound. And so even though there are problems, there's again this potential if we give them the chance, because they can reproduce and there's enough diversity out there within the species. How about that?
That's great. Thanks.
That works, Lang?
That's great. And I wanted to mention that we actually just got a response from Josh Reed, who is a professor at the university. He's a historian in the American Indian Studies Department at the UW, and he is saying that Native Americans did restock streams, but I have now I've lost his comment. Where is it, Josh? I'm going to find it. Here we go. Oh, it says Indigenous peoples did restock salmon streams up on Vancouver Island. So So we've got that information from Josh Reed, who is a historian and works over at the UW and actually has a book on, I think, McCall whaling as well. So,
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. And
Yeah.
Josh is one of the people who I was lucky enough to interview and,
Oh, great.
and set me on a good path. So thank you,
Oh,
again, Josh.
fantastic. Yeah. So let's see, we've got a question from Sue who asks, can you talk about the impact of drainage from the Duwamish River and the impact that has on the Puget Sound ecosystem, and generally how the health of rivers or rivers in general impact the Puget Sound waters?
Yeah, that is an interesting aspect here. There are, as you well know, many rivers and creeks flowing in, something like 2,000 some odd creeks and rivers, the biggest by far being the Skagit, bigger in volume than all the rest combined. But something like the Duwamish, this classic industrial waterway, is putting a lot of bad stuff into the Sound. And I think that it's one of the problems we've seen is that all these creeks do contribute problems. So they contribute pollutants, they contribute sediments washing out into the waterways. That clouds the water, which means you don't have as much kelp. They're bringing in, pollutants. I mean, a classic one would be copper. All of us who drive cars and you put your brake on, there's coppers washing off, and that has a negative effect on the rockfish, has a negative effect on the salmon. There's that study just last year about a new pollutant that they were finding in the creeks that, again, humans are responsible for. Yeah, they are sadly really altered, can have a negative effect on the ecosystem because of bringing sediments and pollutants in particular.
That's worrisome.
Yeah.
So let's see, we've got so many questions here. I'm just trying to get to as many as I can. We have one here from Anne Ferguson, who I think might work for the library. Hi, Anne. So it's a lot of friends here tonight. Anne asks, what was your most surprising finding in your research for the book?
That geoduck are the cutest little animal ever.
Oh, now we're gonna have to find a photo and put it in the chat.
I think, well, one was the diversity of the Sound. That really, I knew nothing about. Just so many species of all different sizes live in the Sound. So that certainly was one aspect of it, and to be able to go out and see them and hold some of them was really amazing. I think from a human aspect of it was that relationship between the waterway as a highway and people as that thread that really knits things together. Yeah, I think now it's sort of become the roadways, but for the first 12,000 plus years of the Sound, it was the waterway. And for many, obviously, it still is important. I mean, if you think about the way we even put ferries on a map, they look like they're part of the highway system. So I think the Sound is still viewed as a central network of transportation. So maybe that's one aspect of it.
That's great. So I have a couple more questions. There's just so many wonderful ones. So I want to get to as many as I can. We have a question from, I think it's Broha, maybe. How might the values of protecting the Salish Sea, the orca, the salmon, the herring show up in city, county, and state policy? Which I think that's the $60 billion question.
Right. So basically, how can we, I mean, I think it gets back, I don't know if problem is the right word. I think the challenge is that we've long looked at the Sound, Puget Sound, and seen it as salmon and orca. And that's what we need to be concerned with. These are the two sexy species, and yes, incredibly important to the ecosystem, but we have to look at it from connectivity, that all of these things all of them are related. As one biologist put it to me, if you don't have herring, you don't have orca. And yet, when we read the studies about orca, it does not necessarily get back to herring and that food web relationship. So I think it's really encouraging government to think that way, that we are responsible. maybe historic, yeah, there's certainly issues we have with industry has created some major problems over time, but we are also part of it. We can never exclude ourselves from this conversation. And from the equation of what's going to work to make this a better place. We all have to get involved, whether it's, you know, voting for people, contributing money to the wonderful organizations, volunteering, or just getting out and appreciating it. Being out on the water, taking the time to sit and watch the tide change one day. That was one of my favorite days working on this book, because I went to Discovery Park and sat for 12 hours and watched the tide go in and the tide go out and the tide come back in. Just amazing. I highly encourage everyone to do that. Maybe not right this minute, but
Yeah, being present in the land like
very
that.
much,
Yeah.
very much, Dasha, yeah.
Well, that actually relates to the idea that we have personal investment, relates to a question from Tom and Lyanda. The wonderful writer Lyanda Haupt is also with us tonight. And so, yeah, oh, beautiful. Yeah. So they say, congratulations on a beautiful and important book. You mentioned that everything we do affects Puget Sound and all the beings that inhabit the home waters. If you could name a couple of practical household changes you'd like to see everyone make on behalf of the Sound, what would it be?
Drive less.
COVID's helping with that.
Right,
Maybe.
COVID's helping with that.
Yeah.
I think getting involved with the local organizations that are out there. You've got Puget Sound Restoration Front, Northwest Straits Commission, all the little organizations that are out having an impact on this, volunteering. I think from an impact point of view, you know, stop washing flushing drugs down the toilet, being aware of, you know, trying to walk more, not just recycle, but reduce and reuse. I mean, I was talking to a friend the other day who was saying, oh yeah, my neighbor said to me, you know, I get 8,000 Amazon packages every hour, but I recycle all of them. Well, if you didn't get 8,000 an hour, you'd have less recycling, which would be that much better. So, you know, just don't buy crap all the time. How about that?
Except for this book. And
right, except for this book and maybe a glass of whiskey every once in a while.
Josh's book and Langdon's
book
and Langdon's book. Yeah, books are great. Just get them from Elliott Bay right now.
Right, exactly.
Well, so we have a question here from Goldie. Goldie says it's about sort of the idea of calling something Puget Sound versus calling the body of water the Salish Sea. What is your thinking on this? Could you talk about that?
Hi, Goldie. That's a really fundamental question, and it was one of the ones that I faced at the very beginning of the book, because I clearly state that this book is about Puget Sound and it's not about the Salish Sea. I mean, I think the Salish Sea is a very important name. This idea that the Strait of Juan de Fuca going out to Cape Flattery, the Strait of Georgia going up the inland passage of Vancouver Island, and then going south down into Puget Sound, is a unified body of water. And it's an important term. It's a term that really helps explain some bigger issues. But my goal was not to write about that. My goal was really to consider Puget Sound. I mean, I think it's a legitimate name. It's been around since 1792. The oldest name we have that we know is from the Lushootseed Wholge, which means salt water. And what's wonderful about that term, and if we're going to really go back to a term, that's what we should use, is it's a relationship term. It's that it was used to describe the relationship to place. We are of the salt water. And they actually, one of my, maybe getting back to Anne's thing, probably the funniest thing that I read was from a ethnographer who described interviewing someone from this area, and I forget who it was, said, if you wanted to insult someone and said they didn't have good breeding, you would say, oh, you're up like that person from up yonder, Issaquah. Which I thought was sort of funny, but it was because they lived on the fresh water and the other people lived on the salt water. So I don't think there's a right or wrong term. It's really, what are you describing? If you're describing the area south of Admiralty Inlet, it is Puget Sound. Just like if you describe Mount Rainier is part of the Cascades. There's nothing wrong with using either ones. It's the size you're talking about.
Okay. That's good. Well, we are wrapping up here, but I have, let's see, two more questions for you. There's so many wonderful questions, and I wish we had time to get to all of them. Somebody asks, they don't say who they are, but somebody asks, I've seen maps with platted lots in the water off Discovery Park. What's that all about? Do you know?
Seattle, hubris, craziness. So yeah, no, those maps, which I have seen many times, started in the 1890s. They platted all of the area of what's now where what I call the kingdoms. Notice I've got a kingdom pin on right here. All of that area was platted and then eventually developed. But when they did that platting, they laid it out all the way around Discovery Park, around what we call Magnolia. And I think it was just aspirational and hubris and Seattleistic about, oh, we're gonna build some sort of seawall out there and develop it. And of course, none of that fortunately ever happened. But again, if you've been out, when you go out to watch the tide change at Discovery Park and you see that beach that goes out for a quarter mile in, you could get why they thought they could develop it. It makes sense.
Yeah. So let's see, two more questions. Okay, I know I said one more, but let's use this opportunity. We have a question again from, I think it's Broha. To your point about relationships being really important, which organizations are best positioned to facilitate awareness, education, and conservation tactics for Salish Sea?
Good question. As I've said before, I've been lucky. I mean, several of the groups, I really like the work that Puget Sound Restoration Fund has been doing out in the Sound, particularly with restoration. Northwest Straits Commission is doing a lot of great work, particularly with, they've done work where they pull up the nets that have sunk down into the Sound and opening up habitat from that point of view. There's just they're all, I mean, there's so many of these just little organizations that are doing good things out there. I mean, the Nature Conservancy is taking a big view, but I think it's looking for what's right around you. Some of these groups that are very small, local, doing habitat work, looking and trying to figure out what's out there.
That's great. Thanks. Well, so my last question for you before we wrap up is from Jacqueline. And Jacqueline is wondering that, one, it's safe to do so. Will you be leading field trips out on Puget Sound? Because
that would be fun.
You want to talk a little bit about the field trip kind of the field trips that you run?
In the past, in the pre-pandemic days, I did a lot of walks around Seattle, basically sort of out of my book, Seattle Walks. But I think it personally would be really fun to be able to do something out on some of the boats that are out, that are going out on the Sound. Anyone wants to contact me about taking me out on their yacht or their sailing vessel or their, I'm game. I think it'd be fun. But I mean, I think again, and I'll leave it with this. So one of the goals of the book, in the chapter on the Sound as a Maritime Highway, is I tried to ride all the ferries in Seattle. And Puget Sound, excuse me. And I was lucky enough to spend some time with one of the captains, Marcia Morse, who's just this amazing person. And when we were riding the ferry, she said, I grew up in Eastern Washington, and living in that part of the world, I would look out and you have these great big open views. And she said, as a captain on the boat, one thing that I've recognized is that same thing here. When you're out on the water in Puget Sound, and you can look out and you have these big views, you're not deep in the forest that we all love. And you see that there's something spiritual about it. Mm. So I think the idea of being out on the water, there's a very utilitarian aspect of the ferry, but there's also a really spiritual aspect. And that to me is sort of the Sound. I mean, there's this practical nature to the Sound, but the reason we live here is because it is this incredible, beautiful, beautiful landscape that needs our love and needs our protection and needs our care. And my hope is that with this book, that it would help people see some of those stories and develop those deeper relationships. Because as I keep saying, we're all part of that community. We're all part of the solution to making this a better place. And I'd like to just end by thanking Stesha, thanking Marianne for her wonderful questions, thanking Karen, Elliott Bay, for all the support for the work that I've done over the years. And again, the work for all of the local authors, such as the people we mentioned. We're incredibly lucky, the literate city that we live in, and we owe it so much to our independent bookstores and the independent people who are making this a better place. So it's been an honor and a pleasure to speak to everyone. So to you, I
Aw,
toast you.
thanks. I've got my, oh, you can't see it with my thing. I've got fancy water with like spa water. So I'll toast with that.
Excellent.
Well, thanks so much, David. It's just been such a delight to help you launch this book out into the world. And thanks, Marianne, for the wonderful interview. And yay, there you are. Hello.
Hey, Marianne.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. And so for those of you that haven't had a chance to read David's book yet, signed copies of the Home Waters and also his other wonderful books are available for our friends at Elliott Bay Book Company. And as I mentioned, they're open for limited browsing, curbside pickup and delivery. And you can find books at their website, elliottbaybook.com. And we posted a link in the chat for that there. And you can, of course, also find David's books at the library, and our website is spl.org, and we will also post a link to David's books in the chat if you want to check them out from the library. We are grateful to everybody who made tonight's program possible. Ms. Marianne Gwynn, who's with us right now, the program partners, Elliott Bay Book Company, our sponsors, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, the Seattle Times, and the Seattle Public Library Foundation. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. It's been wonderful to have you here. And David, let's do this again when the next book comes out, but let's do it in person.
Yes.
Okay.
In person, when the paperback comes out.
Perfect. Let's
Hint,
hope
hint, Nicole.
well, let's hope it's safe to be in person by then. Okay.
Yes.
Well, thanks everybody. Have a wonderful evening and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Well.